This episode is brought to you by SteelRoot, a national leader in helping companies meet cybersecurity compliance requirements and prepare for CMMC. Their experienced team of engineers and consultants assist organizations of all sizes to implement and manage IT systems that meet the technical requirements in DFARS and CMMC. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of 123 CMMC. My name is Dana Mantilia, and I am the host. And today we have a very special guest. We have Amira Armond, and she is the owner, right, of Kieri Solutions. So, hi. Amira, tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about your company.
Hi, Dana. Thank you. Golly. Well, I started my career working with the military as a contractor. Spent, about 16 years working on secure military networks, primarily on the sysadmin side. So building them, supporting them, making sure they work, making sure the users can be functional. And over time, I had seen this cybersecurity stuff way back in like 2002. And people were starting to branch off into careers, and I said, why are we separating cybersecurity from our systems? Like, we ought to be incorporating cybersecurity as we build these systems, right? It just doesn't make sense to give it to some other person and just completely ignore it as you're building the system. So I've always incorporated cybersecurity concepts and designs as I build the systems. And with the DoD work that I did, I eventually got to the point where I was, integrating networks, doing systems architect work, even failover, where it's kind of grim, but sometimes the DoD wants to make sure that if an entire site goes offline, the rest of the network keeps working, right? So that's the sort of work that I did for them. And so I started my own company a little bit more than 5 years ago, and happened to run into CMMC at a conference I think it was the second time it was ever presented in public, and wrote a blog post about it, which turned into cmmcaudit.org, which is a site that I edit. So it kind of turned into a specialist on CMMC ever since then.
That website is a great website too. So I'm going to make sure we put it up there for people to go check out, because there's a lot of good stuff on there that you have. So that is fantastic. All right. So today we are going to talk about documentation, everybody's favorite thing, documentation. So our first question is going to be level 1. We don't need to do anything for documentation, right?
Sure, except for the cases where you actually do need documentation. So CMMC stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, right? So what is that? That's that first M, maturity. That's closely related to the CMMI standard, which is all about documentation. Right? It's about making sure that you write down what your company is supposed to do, and then people do it, and it gets updated constantly as time goes on, as things change, and you're constantly improving your processes, right? So the CMMC is extremely concerned with your documentation, your processes through the levels. However, at level 1, they really don't have requirements for documentation per se at that maturity level viewpoint, right? What they do have is specific cybersecurity requirements that will say things like, you have a procedure for this, right? You have identified that. So when you're reading the CMMC level 1 assessment guide, which should be required reading for everybody who's doing this, make sure you're looking at the assessment guide, by the way. You'll see keywords: document, procedure, policy, identify, right? And those generally mean that you have something written. So for those cases, make sure you have documentation somewhere to show your assessor.
Well, I also think too, is when you're trying to implement a policy or something, how are you going to roll this out to everybody if it's not written down somewhere somehow? So you could say, everybody, okay, this is the policy. You need to read this. You need to learn this. Now we need to implement this. I mean, unless you're like a company of one and then you just, have it all up here. I don't know. But you're absolutely right. They got to make sure they have it where it is required there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what's the expectation for policies documentation at level 2 and above?
Okay, so this is where we start getting into the maturity aspect. So if you are going for CMMC level 2 or level 3 or higher, you're expected to have policy documents which address each of the 17 cybersecurity domains in the CMMC. Stuff like access management, awareness and training, risk management, right? What they want to see is you have documents. They can be paper, they can be digital, that have a purpose defined, right? This policy is about protecting our company against access-related threats, for example. They want to have a scope which says what the policy applies to. Right, so it could mean your entire company. It could mean your enterprise network for the United States, if you're a big company, or it could just be for a little enclave, if you're segmenting your company to just have part of it CMMC compliant, which a lot of companies are doing because it's quite cost effective compared to trying to do security for their entire company. And then after the purpose, the scope, you need to identify roles and responsibilities, right? Which at a very minimum is something like our security officer is responsible for implementing access control for the company. You want to have an endorsement, which is hopefully somebody in your executive staff, right? So in general, it's not your security officer. It's going to be the security officer's boss, unless you're a one-person company. And it's going to be hopefully a signature, right? Technically, you don't need a signature. A lot of assessors want to see a signature that says, I formally give this person responsibility for implementing this policy. And they need to be updated. So most assessors look at it, go, hey, was this reviewed at least once a year, right? Show us that you reviewed it, and hopefully update it if something changed. And then if you've got any regulatory concerns, maybe your company has to adhere to HIPAA or PCI, you should address that in the policy document.
Okay. Yeah, and the other thing too is that when they come in, they're going to want to see, like, when did you put this together? Last night? They're going to want to see that there's like a history that this is written and you've been following it. So, okay, what's the expectation for procedures documentation at level 2?
Okay, so procedures is a huge topic, and this is honestly probably half of the workload involved with CMMC. You cannot underestimate this requirement. So essentially, when we compare 800-171, which is currently required, versus CMMC level 2 and above, 800-171 will say stuff like, you need to document a process for this thing, right? You need to have a procedure for publication reviews, or you need to identify who's authorized to do whatever, right? And those are very specific items that they want to see procedures for or documentation for. For CMMC, they want to see procedures, something written out for how you are going to perform and implement every single technical requirement in the CMMC that applies to your level. Okay, so if you're doing level 3, there are, hopefully I can remember this, 130 technical requirements, right? Technical practices. And I think 382 assessment objectives for technical practices. And the assessor is going to say, show me your procedures, your documentation, right? So it could be many things. It could be inside of your policies if you have detailed policies. It could be procedures. It could be control statements where you say our company shall use the following solutions. But they want to see something written that says how you're going to do each of those 130 practices, each of those items called out in the assessment objectives in hopefully great detail. And it's a little bit uncertain now just how much detail you have to go into. So it could be potentially something as little as, when you're building the system, the technician who's building the system must configure complex passwords, for example, right? That could be a procedure. Or you could go to the extreme and say, when you're configuring a Windows 10 system, the technician in charge shall go to, local security policy, open this menu, find this area, and, set the following values. And we're not totally sure at this point how deep you have to get into the procedures to pass. But you definitely need to have something written for every single practice at the very minimum.
And then when they come in, now you've documented this procedure. Now they want to witness the procedure or have some proof this is actually happening. So it's not just, obviously we're talking about documentation, but then we also need to follow what the documentation is saying.
Yep. And that is actually something that's assessed, is not only that you have it all written down, but that you're actually doing what it says.
Okay. What's the expectation for plan documentation at level 3 and above?
So the level 3 requirement for a plan is in response to one of the DoD's pet peeves, which is companies, and this is from the past, right? This is from the 800-171, is companies will say that they're doing something.
SteelRoot, a national leader in helping companies in the defense industrial base with CMMC preparation and federal cybersecurity regulations. Big or small, SteelRoot is here to help design, build, and manage IT. The SteelRoot reference architecture is a secure, cloud-native operating environment built on zero trust principles. SteelRoot also provides managed cybersecurity, IT, and virtual ISSO services. Visit steelroot.us for more information.
But then they don't staff the resources to do it, right? So they'll say that we patch, right? We're good on patching, right? We got that. And then when you actually go in and say what's going on with your patching, they go, well, we actually only have one person assigned to it, and we've got 50,000 computers, and so they're 6 months behind on patching, right? Super common scenario. So the DoD added this plan requirement that says you need to show at a company level, executive level, at least, if it's for your entire company, highest level, right? CFO, CEO level. If it's for an enclave, then it needs to be at a level that's responsible for budgeting that entire unit of your organization. And it needs to say, here's how we're going to fund the technology. Here's how we're going to fund the people. Right? It also needs to say, here's the people we're going to have, right? So if CMMC level 3, let me back up. If you've been doing basic IT stuff, right? So you're not even paying attention to CMMC. You're not really doing 800-171. If you've been handling your help desk with 2 people for your company, right? And they're doing your servers and they're handling the help desk tickets, you should expect something like 4 to 5 people in your IT department once you're doing level 3, right? So it's a pretty heavy increase in cost and labor, going from very little cybersecurity to a fully mature level 3. And they want to see that in your plan. They want to see that you have budgeted for experienced cybersecurity people, at least one. You have an IT person who can handle the servers. You have adequate incident response support, and how you're going to train them and keep it up over time. So the plan is it's an executive level document that basically says, here's how we're going to organize our IT resources, people and technology, to keep us operating at a CMMC level 3 compliance standard long term.
And I think one of the biggest things that's going to be very eye-opening is that the DoD already thinks everybody is quote unquote doing this, right? Basically, NIST 800-171. So they think that you probably already have 4 people in the IT world because you're supposed to be following some of those requirements. So the CMMC really shouldn't be that big of a burden, but it's for people that really aren't doing anything right now. This, like you just mentioned, that's going to be a very, very, very big additional cost that everyone's going to have to take into consideration. And that's one of my big fears with some of these smaller companies that we really do need. We need them to be able to stay in business, but they have a lot of work to do and a lot of expense to pick up. So that's going to be interesting to see how that winds up going. But
yeah, it's a real concern. I've been in, so my company is a C3PAO, which is a company that has applied to assess other companies against CMMC. And we're very concerned about that too, right? We don't want to see, just from a personal standpoint, as a citizen of the United States, right, as a patriot, I don't want to see our defense industrial base just in mayhem because people can't afford this cybersecurity. There's potential solutions, right? Managed services providers are one way that small businesses reduce costs, right? Especially when you're talking about 2, 5, 10 people, right? But most managed services providers don't know how to do CMMC. So we need to build that capability. The C3PAOs have asked the DoD to provide some guidance on whether, primes could host subs on their systems, whether it's possible for people to, say, build a CMMC compliant system and then rent space on it, and maybe have 10 small businesses on their information system, which would dramatically reduce costs, right? But we haven't heard from the DoD whether or not that's an acceptable solution. So it's a dangerous proposition right now. Hopefully in the next, say, 2 to 3 years before CMMC gets really enforced, we'll have an answer.
Well, that would be great if they could create something like that, because that would definitely help with the financial burden of that. So yeah. Okay, so what is the difference between documentation used for evidence, policies, and procedures?
So for CMMC, the major difference between 800-171 and CMMC, well, there's multiple differences, but one more difference is that CMMC is going to have a third-party assessor come out and look at your system and your evidence to make sure that you check all the boxes. Previous to CMMC, you do a self-assessment, right? And in some companies, what does that look like? Your IT department gets into a room and you go down the assessment checklist, do we have lockout thresholds? Well, Joe, do we have lockout thresholds? Yeah. Okay, we're good. Check that one off, right? An assessor is not going to be able to do that. They're going to need to say, okay, all right, Joe says we do. Now show me, right? And showing them might be actually going to your configurations where it says, configure the computer to lock out after 3 bad attempts. or it could mean that we actually go to a random computer and type in passwords and see if the computer locks out, right? It might be all three. We might need to do an interview, an exam, and a test. When you are trying to prove that you're doing something, your documentation, there's going to be a heavy amount of documentation just to show evidence that you're doing things, right? Which is separate from your policies and procedures. So, for example, in the CMMC where it says, you identify something or you authorize something, a lot of times that means you've got a list, right? That might be on a piece of paper. So that would be documentation used for evidence that's not your policies and procedures.
Well, wouldn't it, like a visitor log, that would kind of be, example, a basic example for somebody that this is who's coming and going, and we're writing it down. Keep a check of that.
Yeah, and if you've done other audits, for example, with ISO, they'll generally call them records. So a record might be something that's generated based on your policies and procedures, right? So you might have 1,000 records, but one procedure which says how you're going to generate those.
That makes it a little easier when you separate it and call it a record versus documentation, because it gets a little muddied in there, but so I like that. But okay. All right. So what about somebody that says, well, my company is already NIST SB 800-171 compliant. So what documentation is going to have to change for CMMC?
It's mostly just the maturity stuff. So they're referred to as .999, 998, 997 requirements. That's the numbers assigned to them. That's the policy, procedure, and plan. So with 800-171, that's focused more on, have you actually configured your systems for security? Are you actually doing the cybersecurity? CMMC wants you to do the cybersecurity as well as write how you're doing it. So with 800-171, you generally would only need to write down policies and procedures as required by 800-171, right? So it would literally say, you should have a procedure for this, a policy for that, right? For CMMC, if it's a requirement in CMMC, you need to have a procedure for it, right? You need to have a policy that addresses each of the 17 cybersecurity domains, whether or not 800-171 says that you need to have a policy for it.
That's a perfect little summary of the differences right there. So that was good. That was very good. Okay, now I want to ask you a question. So who's the perfect person to reach out to you, to your organization, and say, help me? Who's that person? Who's that company? Who's that contractor? How big are they? What do they do?
Yeah, thank you. So my company, Kieri Solutions, like I said, we're a C3 PAO. We're working on becoming authorized. We're not authorized yet. There's very few companies that are to do actual assessments for certification. In the meantime, what we can do is we can do gap analysis, which is essentially like a pre-assessment, right? It's a review before the real thing, and we have several provisional assessors, right, who are authorized to perform the real thing for an assessment. We've got the procedures, we understand CMMC, so we can give you a very high quality understanding of what your readiness is, whether you would pass, what you would fail on, right? So you have time to fix it. If you're not ready for that, then we can, I have consultants who are network engineers, cybersecurity specialists, documentation specialists who can work with you to build a good quality system security plan, identify what you need to do for migrations, maybe review solutions that might be appropriate for your company. We're technology agnostic. So it's really based on what you need and what would meet the CMMC requirements.
That's good,
so-
because then anybody can reach out to you, and depending upon where they are in their journey, you have a solution for them, or can help them, even if they're really at the very beginning. You can help them. So that's good.
That's definitely the intent. If you're a little tiny company, I hate to say it, there's not good answers. CMMC, especially for CMMC level 3, there's no good answer right now. I would encourage you to go to cmmcaudit.org, read through it. It's not a salesy place. There's no paywalls. You don't have to give us your email address to get access to anything. And it talks about, things you can do to start becoming compliant right away. But again, the estimates for CMMC level 3, 50,000, 100,000, right? And that's not even talking about how to actually build your system, right? So right now it's tricky. I think in the next, say, 2 to 3 years, there will be cost-effective solutions, but they don't exist yet. But you can always, check my company website. If you're ready for, bringing a consultant, let me know. If you're not, if you're trying to just get educated, go to cmmcaudit.org.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very, very much for that. Is there anything else that you'd like to throw out there before we go?
No, I really appreciate this, Dana.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for all of your expertise, and I'm sure everybody learned a lot about all this lovely documentation with CMMC. So thank you for your time, and thank you everybody for watching, and hopefully you'll tune into our next little episode. So take care in the meantime. We'll see you around. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This episode is brought to you by SteelRoot, a national leader in helping companies meet cybersecurity compliance requirements and prepare for CMMC. Their experienced team of engineers and consultants assist organizations of all sizes to implement and manage IT systems that meet the technical requirements in DFARS and CMMC.